All right, so I've been hard at work on the map tiles again. It seems like I'm totally obsessed with map tiles, but I really want to get it right, and that's why I've done so many iterations, and every iteration is getting better. So as long as things are moving in a positive direction, I feel like the amount of time I'm spending on map tiles is worth it. This is the very oldest version, the very first version of my new tile system, and it had a lot of problems. The passages were too small and claustrophobic, and there was way too much negative space, and I was breaking the grid, and it was too monochrome. There was just a lot of like weird issues with that first version. And then the second version is when I beefed up the size of the passages, filled in a lot of the negative space, and started working on kind of cool shadows versus warm lit spaces. This version was too dark and a little too clean, and there were just a lot of weird issues with it. And then I did a third version where I tried to lighten up the shadows a little bit. I started adding various details like the randomizers for the exits, but I still got a lot of feedback that something was just off about this version as well. A couple people mentioned that it felt kind of sci-fi, and a couple people were asking like what the scale of these chambers is supposed to be. It took me a long time to figure out exactly what was tripping people up, and then I realized it's really just the size of these tiles, these floor tiles. They're too regular, they're too small, and it just doesn't feel ancient. And so my original tiles before I went with the new design were rough hewn tiles, and they just felt very medieval, very fantasy like. And these new tiles are just way too clean. And so my goal was to come up with a new iteration that was a hybrid. So this is the brand newest version. I'm using all the new tricks that I learned with the new tile sets, like the wider passages and more breathing space. And I'm keeping all the iconography for the randomization, and like the square versus round center dots, and all the iconography for the pools and tentacles and stuff. But I'm using sort of the older hand-drawn, rough-hewn tiles for the floor tiles now, and I think this version is a lot better than the last version. It does not look sci-fi anymore, in my opinion. It looks more fantasy slash medieval. I just think the whole thing reads a little more hand-drawn. I added some little texture and details into the negative spaces just to give the whole thing a little more texture. I've desaturated the colors a little bit. I also have color filters that I can play with here. If I want to completely desaturate, I could take this thing all the way down to grayscale if I want to go with just like a grayscale version of this. This is like halfway to grayscale, but I can click on here and take the saturation from -50 all the way to -100, which would make it completely gray. Or I can do just like desaturated, but not totally desaturated. And then I also have brightness contrast adjustment layer here. So, I can pump up the brightness, I can pump up the contrast, I can leave all those off. I can turn on desaturation and pump up the contrast and brightness. So I have a lot of control over what the final product's going to look like now. But I do think that this is working better than any of the previous versions. So that's why I'm obsessing over this stuff. I really want to get this right. I want the map tiles to really sing. So I'm going to print these out. All right, so I've printed out my new map tile art, and this is my attempt to take all of the learnings of the past few iterations on the temple tiles and combine them with the old rough-hewn, hand-drawn dungeon tiles. And so this was the last version of the map tiles that I got a lot of great feedback on. And then this is the new version. So I think I'm finally at a point now where I'm happy with how the map tiles are looking, at least in terms of the way I'm drawing them. So I like the line work now. These do not feel sci-fi to me anymore. They feel fantasy. They feel very D&D. They look like stone tiles, stone floors. And I might experiment a little with color, but for the most part, the line work is pretty much done at this point. I'm just gonna play with color a little bit to get the colors dialed in. So these are out, these are in. I've also been playing around with, with some of the finer details. There were several comments on making the gaps and the pits look more like gaps and pits, and maybe even putting some art down in there like bones or spikes or something. So here I've just kind of done some really light illustration of like piles of bones down inside the pit. I put a little red outline around the pit and then the little red X. So this is my attempt to kind of beef up what the pits look like. And then I've also made the center hole that the worm comes out of a pit with bones to increase the quality of these little sigils that the cultists need to stand on during the ritual of the old worm. And I'm also playing around with color schemes for the secret passages. I'm still working on that. I iterated on the randomizers a little bit, and I also iterated on the backs of these cards. I made the dark spaces even darker so they're almost the color of the background. I think this works a lot better. I think the tile art works a lot better. It's a lot more like this old tile art was, but with all the bells and whistles that I've been slowly adding in to these over the last few weeks. And then a couple people mentioned that the character cards felt a little cramped, especially when they're fully loaded with equipment. The item slots are pretty small, and when you've got 6 items on the character card, it's pretty cramped, pretty crowded. So I got suggestions to maybe make the character cards a little bigger, or maybe even use like a square format. So I played around with a square design for the character card. At first I was reluctant to do that, but I do sort of like the idea that maybe, this entire game could be a deck of 3.5 by 3.5 inch cards, and then like some cheat sheets, some counter cheats. The basic premise behind this new card design is that it contains all the information. I've been simplifying the special abilities for the characters anyway, from like 3 special abilities down to 1. And I wanted to make the item slots a little bigger, so there's a little more breathing room for the items. So now these are going to be a lot less crowded, and I sort of came up with this little scheme for like double-handed weapons will be sort of just placed right there, and there's sort of a little icon here to represent that. I'm curious what the thoughts are on square character cards. Is it too weird? It looks a little weird just because I've been staring at these for so long, but I personally think this could work. This could work just fine. I also went from 6 character stats down to 4. I took the 4 that I use all the time. I ditched belief and psyche because I think that the sanity and the psyche are basically the same thing, and so you can do sanity tests instead of psyche tests. And belief, I just don't think was ever really going to get used for anything useful, so I ditched the belief stat altogether. So the heroes are a little simpler, a little cleaner, and the question is thoughts, opinions on the square cards. I'm willing to continue iterating on the hero card design. The one thing I'm not willing to do is redo the hero art or redo the aspect ratio of the hero art. So whatever my final hero card design needs to be, the hero art needs to be this size and this aspect ratio. So that's why that's why this card looks the way it does, because I just wanted to copy this verbatim over to this card and then figure out how to organize the rest of the design to work within those constraints. Here's what the other character cards look like. I don't know. It's kind of growing on me. And like I said, I like the idea of just all square cards for the game, map tiles, hero cards, monster cards. They're all using this exact same card type. They all come in just one big deck of cards. And so that leads me to my next experiment, which was to take these monster cards that I've been iterating on and I went ahead and designed a square version of that. This monster card was very crowded. This monster card has a lot more room for a lot more information about attacks. And then so, you know, your inactive state, your active state, and your alert state will trigger these keywords like rise and writhe. And then down here, you have instructions for those keywords. So rise, 1d3 sanity damage. You only do that once. So basically, anytime a character sees the old worm, it's so hideous and so unknowable that their sanity is going to take a bit of a hit the first time they encounter the old worm. And then here, you know, on a natural one during combat, the character can become bound up with the old worm. Basically, the old worm like grapples, picks up the character. So then you would test might at 10 to free once per turn, and on a nat 1, the old worm actually swallows the character, and then the swallowed state, 2d6 damage per turn, but you can continue to fight and do conflict rolls while you're inside the worm. So you could potentially kill the worm after you've been swallowed by it, if you can do it before you die. So I just think there's like a lot more opportunity to come up with thematic mechanics for each monster type with these bigger cards. And I like how it all fits on one side of the card. And then of course, as I'm working on these, I end up doing a lot more revisions to the art. I've got these like pustules on the plague rats now, and I renamed them psycho rats because I just think that's cooler. And I've got like drool coming from the rats. So one reason that I end up spending way too much time on this stuff is that I get kind of sidetracked into making the art, into iterating on the art over and over again. But, you know, as long as everything's continuing to get better, it just seems worth it. So these are all blank, so I can continue to like kind of work these out in pencil as I continue to play test. But I think I'm ready to do some more play testing now. I'm curious what your thoughts are on square character cards, square monster cards, and I'm curious where you're at with like these new map tiles.